So I was invited to a friend's house for a braai. A braai is similar to a barbecue but with real wood, big fires and a lot of meat. A South African tradition. Anyway, I didn't really want to show up empty-handed at my friend's house. So I walked into the garage, workshop, looked at my scrap pile and decided I was going to make something. So essentially I grabbed some scrap wood strips. These were about 8 millimeters in thickness. I cut off the one edge and then I cut it to size at about 30 millimeters in width. Then on the router table, I rounded over the two edges on one of the faces. So then we quickly removed the saw marks with the palm sander and then onto some hand sanding the roundovers with a profiled sanding block. Then using a stop block we cut the pieces into 90 millimeters in length. We need 12 of them. So we're going to use some leftover leather from one of my previous builds as a base for the coasters. So we take the block, it's about 100 millimeters by 100 millimeters, just as a rough guide. You don't need to be precise, just cut it. It is larger than what the end product will be anyway, and we'll trim it later. So we spread some contact cement onto the leather. And then onto the wood. And then we let it dry for a bit. Now this stuff is vile, but it works and it creates a permanent bond. Once the contact cement is dry to the touch, you can then carefully place the wood onto the leather, give it some pressure to create that permanent bond. Be really careful when placing these things. Once they've touched the contact cement, they are glued. Period. So now we just trim off the excess leather. So using some 120 grit sandpaper, we just clean up the edges of the leather and clean up the edges of the wood. Taking a small blowtorch, we just scorch the edges of the leather to get rid of all the fluff. Now it's time to finish. Using some hard wax oil, you first apply it to all the cracks and crannies and the surfaces of the wood. And once it's sat for a little while, you come back and you rub off the excess and buff it to a nice sheen. So the coasters are done. So let's start with a little holder just to make it a nice little present. So scratching around in my pile of offcuts, I found this piece of walnut and I proceeded to cut it down the middle so that I have 2 even pieces to work with. With a quick sand we remove the saw marks and just get it up to about 120 grit. So using a square I just established the starting edge, then using the coaster I established the width, and I take a 1/4 inch spacer and then I just to give it a little bit of margin. And again with the miter saw we cut 3 equal strips at that length that we just established. Using some blue tape on the back, I just put the strips together, adding some glue. And then using a couple of clamps to clamp it to the work surface as well as to give it a little bit of pressure so that until the glue clears. I always clean up the glue squeeze out as much as possible, especially on delicate wood. We put a round over on just one edge. This will become the top edge of the little box. So here we're just using blue tape again, and we're just gluing that up using the blue tape as clamps. Now I admit this is a little bit sketchy, but actually it's quite safe on the router table. I'm just putting a round over on the bottom of the bottom panel. And again, using blue tapes as clamps, we glue the bottom to the box. And using a little brush and a little bit of water, I just clear out the glue squeeze out in the insides where my fat fingers can't get to. So then it's some hand sanding with a sanding block. Remember to break all the sharp edges and corners. Then we add the same hard wax oil finish. Wait until it's dry and buff off the excess. If you enjoy small projects like this, please consider subscribing. And now I think it's time for a drink.